A warm welcome back to the channel. My name is Tom, and you're watching youtube.com/getnuanced, and potentially actually the podcast, which I'll definitely create an audio friendly version for Anchor and all the other places which will be syndicated on. So if you are someone who is on the commute or trying to not watch a video and just want to still get up to date with all the pressing matters that at least I find interesting over here on Get Nuanced, then I do recommend you check out the description below for not only the links I just talked about, but also resources pertaining to this topic, which I definitely think requires more than just you watching this particular segment or any series of segments on YouTube. It's a very complicated situation with what's going on over in the South and East China Sea and the geopolitical significance of what is developing between Taipei and Beijing is nothing short of what is going to be one of the most definitive geopolitical conflicts that will, if anything, with any luck, not materialize in a hot war, but from what it looks like with the continued escalation that has culminated in what was yesterday the official denial from at least Beijing of acknowledging a mutually amicable median line, which would be the demarcation line, or I guess this unofficial point in which the borders and the territories that are claimed and are the sovereign, at least as their sovereignty of the latter is disputed by the former, in the case of Beijing and Taipei, with the dispute between the People's Republic of China, centered in Beijing, as I just mentioned, and the Republic of China, which is ever since 1949, and the ROC's loss of it, the mainland, centered primarily and almost entirely, with the exception of some islands surrounding the main island and some areas within the strait that are also disputed with Beijing, which is, Taiwan. And the situation there has for decades been unresolved, and there had been attempts on and off of a warming of relations, the cross-strait relations talk that I'm sure if you're someone like myself who's been keeping up with these events has heard as a term to describe the complicated nature that at least Beijing calls its one country, two systems, or the one China policy that it is insistent on at all cost maintaining. And that includes also the eventual goal in the case of Beijing of reintegrating the territory of Taiwan, which it sees as a Renegade province, which has no actual formal legitimacy and has just been, stubbornly resisting the central rule of Beijing in the eyes of policymakers there. But in the case of the latter with Taipei and the current president, Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, which ever since their ability recently with the Hong Kong protests, which I can discuss in future segments, as well as the situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province and the further consolidation, which I'll discuss in a little bit when it comes to the Chinese policymakers in Beijing attempting to further homogenize and consolidate their control and the cultural supremacy of the Han Chinese, which includes, mandating that the official language of the nation, Mandarin Chinese, be the way in which even minorities, which across the country up until very recently had been able to enjoy a fairly reasonable degree of autonomy when it came to their education and a lot of their local based ways of doing things, and the things that we all do and how we go about our lives. But with the increased rapid modernization of China, including its advancement when it comes to not just technology, but its military buildup that has, in contrast with I'd say the setting sun of at least when it comes to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, among other things, in China's rapid growth and military expansion, which has allowed it now to be in a position where it can much more assertively demand and, flex its muscles militarily at Taipei, and as well as Washington, which Washington in the United States as being the current, or what it believes to be at least, or what was believed up until post 1991 until 2020 with the coronavirus, which we're still in the midst of, the unipolar superpower. And China, which is essentially in the geopolitical terms one of these new kids on the block, they are now attempting to show that not only are their claims to political legitimacy, not just are they being backed up by symbolic gestures, which were always something that was within the toolkit of Beijing, as much as they are with Washington, Moscow, Paris, London, et cetera, et cetera. It's just one of those tools that politicians will use when it comes to, coming up with ways to ensure that their power is consolidated. And in a position when you're not able to actually make it, you fake it. You fake it till you make it, And in the case of Beijing, up until very recently, most of what they've been doing in response to the increased relationship when it came to the strengthening of ties informally between Taipei and Washington in the form of, there were some symbolic gestures, as in the creation of a diplomatic institution, a building in Taipei with on-site U.S. officials and diplomatic and international relation types, those within think tanks that were, envoys for Washington's interest, which, believe me, as much as the current situation looks like it might be maybe tangentially just between Taiwan and Beijing, or Taiwan and China, it is very much a more global conflict that has a much more proxy-like element to it when you take a deeper look into the internal facts. And in this particular segment, as with others, I'm not going to hide my particular biases as someone who is a U.S. citizen who knows people from Taiwan, and also particularly is more sympathetic towards the Taiwanese belief in wanting to be independent and autonomous, or not just autonomous, but outright be politically independent and separate as an entity from Beijing and China. And that's something I'll discuss at the end of this segment. But when it comes to the facts on the ground, my particular opinions, I will attempt to, as best as I possibly can, divorce and acknowledge when differentiating my particular beliefs from the facts, which, whether they are always contingent on my beliefs or not, which sometimes they will not be, as I will get into this particular segment, among others. And that is something I want to make sure at the end of the day we're pursuing the truth and pursuing facts, and over everything else when it comes to these complicated matters. The waters are already muddied enough between these two countries and their own efforts to spread propaganda and counter espionage and espionage at each other's expenses to, win the hearts and minds of those who are like myself and are just trying to put together the bits and pieces of what's happening and ascertain to the best of ability to make, make myself as least ignorant as possible, especially when it comes to vital events and things that definitely in the long term have broader implications for the power dynamics, not just within Beijing and Taipei, but also within Washington, as the U.S. has invested a lot monetarily as well as politically into this dispute. And in a lot of ways, as I'll get into when it comes to the situation, there's a lot at stake here. And all the sides involved are in a position where they're not going to be willing to back down. And this is going to further tensions, as you see with the median line and China increasing its military drills and having not really kept it any secret for a long time now that their plan was sometime within the 2020s to take Taiwan back, to have it be reintegrated within the broader Chinese state. And that was something that they were hoping to achieve through peaceful diplomatic means. But they always had the caveat, if diplomatic talks were to ever, in the event, not reach anything but impasse when it came to Taiwan, not wanting to have to unconditionally reintegrate and potentially suffer now from what we've seen what's going on in Hong Kong and the reneging of the initial agreement in 1997 when the United Kingdom, which admittedly during the Opium War with dubious intentions and circumstances, had been able to, under an agreement, under a situation where the former Chinese Empire under the Qing dynasty, which was already waning at the time politically and just, as a cohesive unit in China, but they were willing to sign off fragments of Chinese territory. And in the midst of that period in general, former areas that had once been under the sway of the Chinese emperors had either been broken off into autonomous units or had been annexed by the other great powers of the time, including Japan, which had Taiwan, which was formerly known as the island of Formosa. And after World War II, when the United States won the Pacific campaign and the Soviets themselves had joined in as well and were mopping up operations in the East, following all of that, Japan gave the island in a treaty back to China. And at the time, China had had a truce between the internal factions that were in dispute, which were the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, which was founded by Sun Yat-sen, who's considered the modern founding father of China, much like Ataturk is for the modern-day Republic of Turkey, or George Washington is here in the United States. You get the idea. But Sun Yat-sen's, his chief successor in the Chiang Kai-shek, the guy who actually ended up being the last member of the Kuomintang party to hold on to the mainland of China. And they after a bunch of internal disputes, which could be a discussion in and of themselves, but just for background, that led to the truce and alliance between Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and the CCP, the Communist Party of China, the Communist Party of China, which would later obviously be this current China's modern government under a certain Mao Tse-tung, who would at the time be nothing more than a peasant rebel who was actually able to, through his own strategic vision and his opportunism, which clearly had, in lieu of the historical narratives, been underplayed. But he took advantage of the fact that Chiang Kai-shek had expended plenty of resources in fighting the Japanese as they expanded into mainland China and had temporarily occupied even cities as important as Shanghai and Nanking. And obviously the rape and massacre of Nanking is one of many issues of the Japanese Empire, which mirrors that in terms of Nazi Germany. And even if you understand the nature of war, the British Empire, the United States, France, all these countries involved with these different conflicts, Russia, etc., they all had blood on their hands. But at the end of the day, that is another broader philosophical discussion, and I just wanted to point out from my personal point of view. But my opinions aside, again, when it came to the end of World War II and the weakened state of the ROC, with a bunch of stuff happening in between that I can talk about later, including a recommendation from the U.S. for Chiang to put on hold the attempt to wipe out the communists in their last holdout, Mao was able to reconsolidate the CCP. And what they did was afterwards were able to turn the tides of the Civil War, which resumed almost immediately after the Japanese had left, and successfully oust the ROC, the Kuomintang, from mainland China. And in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan, and ever since in Taipei, the Kuomintang, and then later, after Chiang Kai-shek's son was willing to, after his rule, democratize Taiwan, with the now Democratic Progressive Party under President Tsai Ing-wen currently in control, with the Kuomintang actually being the secondary main political party, which is ironically in this situation now more inclined to have a more neutral or friendly relation with mainland China, as historically the older population, which is more in line with the Kuomintang, actually were refugees who fled mainland China, millions of them after the communist takeover in 1949. And Chiang Kai-shek always planned on eventually, under the so-called National Project for National Glory, retaking the mainland, which ended up being a pipe dream that never materialized, as it would always have been contingent on what he hoped to be the aid of the United States and the West at large, which increasingly, in the wake of the broader Cold War and conflicts in Vietnam and Korea, had seen what happened there as a case closed situation. But nonetheless, Taiwan would hold on, at least when it came politically, to the vestiges of its old holdings in terms of its symbolic claims, which included the former straits and island territories that China claims, which are disputed claims within the South China Sea more broadly, that other countries, including Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and others, all have a stake within. And then including the fact now that with Taiwan as well, Chiang Kai-shek, when he left, which will be another discussion, I think, individually, which is interesting, he took many of the artifacts, which are some of the only surviving ones from the ancient Chinese time, as during the Cultural Revolution, Mao would later liquidate many of these. And now we're seeing in modern times an increased consolidation under Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader, who in a lot of ways has displayed the same sort of bravado and strategic vision akin to that of Putin or Erdogan, or many of these others in these countries who are characterized as autocrats, and understanding that the nature of government is far more complicated than epithets and terms which are muddied by negative connotations. These are things that are not necessarily as cut and dry as we tend to take them as, and pop culture tends to stereotype and caricature these things, which I always recommend you don't yourself, because historically these terms have a lot more depth and weren't always necessarily as fixed as we tend to consider them as. And that's just something that, as an aside, that I'll get into in another segment when it comes to political philosophy. But when it comes to this situation, which has remained the case after a failed attempt by Mao to finish what he started, and his successors had ever since would hold on to that mantle and would never give up the claim that Taiwan was part of China, even though historically actually it was never part of the modern political state of China under the PRC. But that aside, it was part of this broader cultural Chinese orbit that there is a claim to be made. Whether it is going to be accepted or realized is something that we're going to see unfold. And that background information, which includes also finally in the 70s with the ROC losing its UN Security Council seat to China after it was able to finally wane enough of its influence. And following by that, year after year, you've seen now China, the PRC, Beijing, increasingly use its influence and resources to, at the expense of Taipei, build relations with other countries beyond just the Belt and Road Initiative, which is another thing that can be discussed in and out itself in a video. There's been tons of different initiatives that have ultimately led to former countries that were maybe more receptive to having a relationship with Taipei, not wanting to anger China, and how China now strictly recognizes only countries that are going to recognize Beijing as the arbiter of all of China when it comes to doing business and having a relationship with them, at least on a formal level. As we're going to see with the United States, as I'll mention in a few minutes now, this is obviously a little bit more complicated than that when it comes to the great powers. But when it comes to the smaller nations, which have largely accepted the situation with China being right now what it is, and with China potentially inevitably reclaiming, if you look at Google Maps and all these other things, which are very sensitive to the considerations of China to make sure they have access to these markets over there, with their billions of people and also their increasing modernization and the middle class situation that's been developing, which is nothing short of actually a pretty extraordinary development, which, keeping in mind the sacrifices and the consequences of some of the more brutal policies of the CCP, which include the camps and everything from the repression from the Hong Kong, independence people and all that other stuff. That's things to keep in mind. But nonetheless, China has proven in the 20th and 21st century with its modernization works that a non-Western democratic style system of government can not only succeed, but thrive in a modern system and even exist parallel to the institutions in the West, which claim to be this inevitable world expanding, kind of universal sort of ideology that's destined to be the permeating vision of how humanity is going to, in our posterity, continue to operate, which is something China's existence in and out itself with its hybrid model that is not really in practice communist, but more so an oligarchic form of corporate capitalism that is similar to the US, but I'd say with the biggest divergence with the West and the US is that it is definitely with Chinese characteristics, as the CCP claims, in the sense that it is very ethnocentric towards the Han Chinese, and harkens back, actually, if one is familiar with the history of China and even ancient Rome, with the idea that the ancient Chinese had that China was Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, or this global empire that sat in the center of the world and was destined to, with the mandate of heaven and the Chinese emperor. And I guess that would carry over now with the modern leaders of China to being the hegemons of a global order, which, following this century of humiliation, which China refers to the periods that were led to places such as Taiwan and Hong Kong and, instead of saying Macau, being lost, and parts of Shanghai, actually, with the concessions of Shanghai and other areas being carved out, and essentially having China for a temporary period being a series of vassal states under warlords which were being patronized by foreign powers, mainly from the West and in Russia and Japan. And that has been something that Chinese policymakers in modern Beijing have been attempting to rectify and show the world, obviously, that China is going through a new era of revitalization and rejuvenization. And part of this, and that's another broader segment in itself, one of the pivotal cornerstones to this achievement of rejuvenation is the reintegration of Taiwan. And when you understand its geopolitical significance, it becomes very obvious to why that would be a chief goal of policymakers in Beijing, and why Taipei and Washington have very much a lot to be concerned, as many, I think, in the US who are outside observers who maybe don't have as much of a very up close and personal understanding of this event. And to us, someone such as myself, who lives thousands of miles away in the comfort of a country that is not indirect threat of a military confrontation, which Taipei is as a Hail Mary, hoping that, and I think a lot of what their preparations, if you understand, for example, the military comparison, which I will include a link if you haven't checked it out and aren't familiar with the comparison between spending of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, Beijing, we call it a lot, the government in China versus the government in Taiwan, which increasingly wants to maintain its independence and has diverged and created an alternative system of government that in very much a lot of ways is antithetical to the CCP, which has every vested interest in snuffing out and reintegrating this territory that has what they perceive as a renegade government. And history will be the one who determines the ultimate verdict. But I think that there's a lot to factor in. And when it comes to this situation, which is by no means settled at the moment, understanding the fact that China and its geography is something that is driving the situation to be more rapidly settled in some sort of way, which the parties involved are going to have to make decisive, take decisive action. It is something that is time sensitive and understandable when you understand the geography and also the timetables of why events are now unfolding in the way that they are. Sorry about that. That was just a brief jump cut. I got a glass of water to drink really quick, as this is definitely going to be a much longer video, as I definitely want to make sure that I don't, miss any of the important details that will definitely provide context. And this video will serve essentially as an introduction to this subject, and we'll bookmark it at the end for further discussion as the events that I'm talking about continue to develop, as the situation with Taiwan and China, as time continues to tick by, is getting more and more of pertinence to geopolitical observers such as ourselves. And I think even laymen should have an interest in this. That is why I have in the background my laptop, if I'm not sure you're going to see in a couple of minutes, which I will look back on for a couple of notes that I have incorporated to make sure that I bring them up and don't miss them out, so you guys can have the full scoop on the situation as best as I've understood and have researched it. So make sure to also check out the description below too when you're done. If you haven't, I've mentioned it so many times, but I definitely stress that this subject is something that requires additional research and more videos, obviously, and podcasts. But when it comes to this topic, I don't want to fail to stress enough how nuanced it is and how much it requires more than just this cursory introduction. But hopefully this one does help nonetheless. And when it comes to the geopolitical situation, which I will probably include somewhere around here, the Google map, and I think it'll become also a description if you link below, just by glancing at it, very obvious to why Taiwan and its particular location in this island in the broader East and South China Sea has such a pivotal role in China's policymaking considerations, and even that of Washington, considering Washington's efforts to, despite its waning in influence and its allowing of the Pacific Fleet to be deprioritized in what I assume must be the prioritization of the Middle Eastern quagmires, which I'll discuss in another segment, but are mostly, I think, a dead end that are largely to the detriment of the U.S. And I think is something that foreign policy-wise is something that is going to have to become to terms with in a much more serious light than the current presidential candidates, either Trump or Biden, are willing or able to do. But that is another discussion, again, for another time. And when it comes to Taiwan in particular, as the events are all interconnected and are broadly looped into this narrative when it comes to how international relations in the 21st century are being configured, and in some ways how they're breaking down in the lieu of the delegitimization of mainstream press and also the political institutions from the U.S. and even China that have been increasingly becoming more hard-pressed to exert and consolidate their control and especially their power, which at the end of the day is something, when it comes to geopolitics, is something we need to always be aware of, that reality and how the nature of power truly works. And hopefully these clips that I make and other future segments will shed that light, and we'll all be able to make more accurate and sincere and knowledgeable assessments of these events, and reach better conclusions, as right now things are getting definitely very tense, and especially due, if you understand, to the increased military drills, which have also been responded in kind back and forth, a game of tit for tat with Taipei and Beijing. Tsai Ing-wen's re-election in January of 2020, earlier this year, had reaffirmed the mandate that she was given by the island's populace, which is diverged significantly when it comes to their outlook and perspective between cross-strait relations between Beijing and Taipei, and in particular, beyond just the capital in Taiwan, just in general. Younger Taiwanese people of the generation such as myself, in the millennial, maybe Gen Z, I was born in 96, so you can be the judge of which one I am, but this sort of younger bracket that is increasingly becoming franchised and are becoming a significant chunk of the electorate, they are the ones who were raised or born in Taiwan who, despite having a Chinese ethnic origin, are culturally more familiarized with Taiwan and had never really been within the orbit enough of Beijing politically and culturally to be inclined to want to reintegrate. However, that's contrasted and juxtaposed highly with the older populace, as I mentioned earlier, which many of them had come from mainland China, including the leader who, under the Kuomintang originally, Chiang Kai-shek, who ruled over all of mainland China. The difference in this cultural outlook and the momentum that the DPP has gotten over the Kuomintang over this particular issue, which had been a pivotal point in Tsai Ing-wen's re-election, which originally saw in the midterms her party actually get trounced. But that was prior to the Hong Kong protest and the coronavirus, which has increasingly shaken up the dynamics of the landscape in terms of how international relations are working out. And the gradual warming of relations between the two cultural spheres, which share a lot in common but have completely diverged when it came to political considerations, it has completely deteriorated. If you understand, ever since Trump's election in 2016, which of all the issues I would criticize the Trump administration on, I think one of the few that I actually could give credit for, and understanding the caveats, obviously, as these I think are not, maybe they're inadvertently arriving at the right outcomes in my belief, but are in obvious case a matter of self-interest and business concerns, which are one of the driving motivations, unfortunately, for Trump and many of the politicians in Washington beyond just his administration. It's the Democrats and the Republicans to a large degree, and just how politics is functioning in the U.S. As someone who is here and studies this stuff enough to understand, it's just one of those things, unfortunately. But be that as it may, when it comes to the incentive structures, whether we can criticize them on a broader level or not, they have led the Trump administration, who, keep in mind the connections, as Elaine Chao, who is the current Secretary of Transportation, a former Bush Assistant Secretary of Transportation, I believe, or Energy Sec, or some sort of bureaucrat, who is actually a Taiwanese American, the daughter of a very, very influential and powerful Taiwanese business mogul, who also, she so happens to be the second wife of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who has some dubious ties and is obviously infamous and is in his own sort of, infamy for the situation with the Supreme Court, which is another topic that is worth its own discussion in and of itself. But I don't want to minimize it, as it has been something that is concurrent and something probably that more people are paying attention to if they're a domestic observer of politics. But as someone myself who's more slanted and interested towards international relations, I want to minimize other domestic issues sometimes, but I do believe that given my field of expertise and my lack of, understanding of some more complex issues when it comes to social matters, which obviously have an importance themselves, but take a different dynamic and perspective, I recommend, and I'll maybe make another subject or video covering those, but I do recommend checking out other people that focus on that stuff primarily if you're interested in that type of thing, but not minimizing, or it's not a contest at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say with these events, but understanding, I think, the broader implications of what's going on with Taiwan and China, and understanding now as I'll get into the U.S. involvement, which from Trump's election and his historic acknowledgement when Tsai Ing-wen called originally to congratulate Trump, historically, U.S. presidents had been more informal with their relations with Taiwan ever since the removal of Taiwan from the UN and having, or the ROC being removed, which Taiwan is known formally as the ROC, still the Republic of China. They still use the same Chinese national anthem that was used in mainland China until 1949. And when it comes to the relations ever since 1979 and the Jimmy Carter administration, when they had the Taiwan Relations Act, which essentially in 1979 created an informal relationship in the form of symbolic and military aid and other forms of under the table agreements, which were supposed to be allowing the U.S. to have its cake and eat it too, as China insisted on the one China policy, which this was a sort of way to, a loophole to have it both ways, but it's something that still has been contentious, which the Chinese government and the foreign ministry in particular has always never hesitated whenever the U.S. has, what they perceive as, walk around on their turf, make a noise about it. But when it comes to the U.S. and the taking of the phone call with Trump, it symbolized the increased relations the warming of relations with Taiwan to a degree in which, and other than the official ratification publicly in sort of a law, has in all but that officially really materialized in a significant increase in involvement with the U.S. And I think an acknowledgement when it came to Obama's broader pivot to Asia prior, along with Trump's actions in Taiwan, and whatever reasons, as there's definitely a multitude of which that are beyond that I just stated and are more than I think this video and all the information public are, we're purview to, maybe in the decades coming as these events take place and as information is classified becomes public, we'll understand the nature of these things more. But I think there's too many coincidences when it comes to who's placed in the government in the U.S. and the considerations with Taiwan, obviously. But nonetheless, as someone who is sympathetic towards Taiwanese independence and as somebody who sees China's influence when it comes to, flexing its muscles at the expense, using the dams geopolitically as a, putting it's essentially with using the geopolitical power of the geography of the dams and their position of Tibet to essentially, eradicate these minority cultural and ethno-religious groups such as the Tibetans, who there's going to be in dispute with that over the Dalai Lama when he passes, as China claims now that they're going to appoint the successor, even though that's against the custom of the Tibetans. That's a dispute. There's one with Mongolia in particular, with the language that they're being forced now to abandon, as Mandarin is being the main language that's only going to be taught in schools. Same with in Xinjiang with the camps, which is a story in and of itself that is very much horrifying, that I think is something that deserves criticism. But keeping in mind the U.S. along with other countries, running a country has never been something that is a clean and squeaky business, unfortunately, and not trying to minimize or overcompensate for what goes on here, but keeping these things in mind and the general attitude of China, which has been to consolidate and to further its hold over its own territories and also its borders and peripheries, to consolidate, especially if you understand the situation with India too, and the conflicts over there, which have never been rectified since the 60s and still are to this day materializing in skirmishes that are always threatening or potentially at risk of escalating into something more, but cooler heads will hopefully prevail on that front. And when it comes to Taiwan, unfortunately, as the calendar, as we all know, when it came to the rejuvenation plan, has predicted, and Chinese policymakers have not really kept any sort of secrets about it, as I mentioned before, the plans to invade sometime in the 2020s. And these military drills might actually be the buildup for that, and is something that, with the constant need for the Taiwanese to scramble their Air Force, with the death, I think, earlier this year of a chief military official in Taiwan, when they already are manpower-wise at a deficit. And if you understand, as I've linked below, the military differences, it's night and day. The Chinese government is able to outspend the Taiwanese government by billions and billions and billions and billions, to the point where it's really no contest. And even U.S. and analysts for these types of things potentially even predict, if China were to risk the ramifications, obviously, that would come in the form of sanctions and international backlash, which for them maybe is something that I think would be, especially with coronavirus, something that they might wait on a little bit, but would definitely be willing to weather the storm for the ultimate geopolitical achievement of reintegrating Taiwan and consolidating and furthering, ensuring that their access to the East and South China Seas are, secured and not at risk of being blockaded, as the U.S. has a significant relationship and defense pact with South Korea, Japan, and as well as the Philippines. And relations have been improving and warming with Vietnam as well, among others. And these types of things are all, with Taiwan together, able to form an essential blockade if the U.S. was willing to, especially if they were to, cut off the Straits of Malacca from the Chinese. This would be something that would bring the country economically to its knees, and not to mention the risk of the U.S. or others forming or aiding color revolutions with these minority groups, which have high separatist tendencies in China. These are all considerations that Beijing have factored into their policymaking concerns. And the U.S., obviously, it's a game of, cat and mouse, back and forth, tit for tat. And Taiwan, essentially, whether it's, obviously something that you're agreeing with or not on their side, is a proxy for this broader new Cold War between the Chinese and the United States, and is something that is very much at risk of escalating right now, and is something that, if you understand the deadlines with the goals of the Chinese leadership by 2049, 2050, the 100th year anniversary of the Communist Party of China, to, at that point, really be able to proudly say that they've rejuvenated this what really is this Chinese empire that is attempting to challenge U.S. and Western supremacy over political, economic, and social affairs in the world, or at least political and economic ones as they exist, and more economic at this point, but the others are all in tandem, and if one is changed, the others will shortly after be impacted by the effects of the others, vice versa. But this is something that the U.S. with Taiwan understands, and is something of a significant importance, and is why there has been murmurs of sending additional aid. And obviously the symbolic gestures of the diplomatic embassies and other accoutrements being built in Taipei, and also the weapons deals that are being signed now that increasingly are providing aid and military equipment along with advisors to Taiwan. This is something that is definitely of significance, and the increased overt relations between Taiwan and Washington has angered, or Taipei and Washington has angered Beijing, and is something that has further, along with the coronavirus, alienated and has led towards this general trend of decoupling between the West, with the U.S. as its current, leader, so-called, and the China and its sphere of influence, which is increasingly being more, able to exercise its own independent vision of what it wants to do in the world, that doesn't have to necessarily be bounded to the considerations of what formerly were the unipolar, Western democracies, or this current New World Order, in the words of HW and the neoconservatives and neoliberal types. This is something that I think is very interesting to study, and I think only this introduction alone is not enough, as I've said before. But when it comes to these topics and what happens, and the reality of the matter with, if Taiwan in this situation does escalate, there's been a lot of proof that China has the military capacity to successfully invade and take over. And there would obviously be backlash, that I mentioned before, but would it be worth it? And that could potentially be, depending on who you ask in Beijing. Of course, I mean, in the sense that they think it obviously will give them not only Taiwan, which will allow them to, have a foothold and be able to resist blockades from the U.S. and being constricted from its access to water. That is something that obviously every, independent sovereign state, especially one that wants to be as powerful and ambitious as China, considers as a bedrock for its national security. And that's something that is something that every party is aware of. And Taiwan in particular has, as I've mentioned before, with its generational divide, increasingly with its younger people seeing themselves now more as Taiwanese and not Chinese, and perceiving themselves as something more distinct from mainland China, which is something that will make integrating it back into the sphere of Beijing, or conquering it, I guess, if you consider this the first time, as a lot more something that is complicated, as now you're going to have to pacify the locals, and otherwise, maybe they're going to be unhappy with this more, intrusive rule, but especially being seen with what they're seeing, like, in Taipei and Taiwan, with what's going on in Hong Kong, with people fleeing from there, and a potential risk in a situation which, much like with Vietnam with the fall of Saigon in 75, with potential refugees by the millions potentially fleeing to the U.S. or others in the wake of this sort of crisis, there would be plenty of ramifications, which this video cannot even begin to really start talking about, as it would really drag this on beyond what would be considered a worthwhile length, and is definitely worth another discussion in and out itself for another topic. But hopefully this particular segment has highlighted and really emphasized, and maybe shed a little bit more light into the complexities of this dispute. And understandably, when it comes to the events on the ground, they are constantly evolving, and by no means will this potential video, by the time it is had a week or two out, will it be up to date with what's going on. So that is why forthcoming, I'll definitely have more content, and I recommend you definitely check out, again, the links in the description, and follow our social media over at twitter.com/getnuanced, or my Twitter @TJC, if you're interested in text-based updates, or check out the website too at www.getnuanced.com, which is going to be a weblog that is launching soon.
And if you enjoyed this discussion on the topic of Taiwan and the question of its future, which is definitely up in the air, don't worry, as more segments along with other content of similar nature regarding international relations and historical context are forthcoming. And make sure, if you can and have time, to be a pal and to subscribe or follow, depending on which platform you're tuning into this on, albeit a more visually stimulating format I tried to develop this time around on YouTube is probably what you'd like to see if you are tuning in on Anchor after this, to see more of a visually indicative guide of the different dynamics of the characters, names, faces, and obviously the geographical extent of this dispute and why it is shaping up to be one of the more interesting ones of the 21st century. But let me know what you think on this and provide feedback when you can, whether via voice or by comment in YouTube or Anchor respectively. And, check out those links below. Thank you for watching and listening, depending on which one it is on, and or. My name is Tom. This has been Get Nuanced, and I will catch you all in the next segment I make real soon. For now, stay safe and peace out.